as you choose, just who you are.
Okay. So I'm Alan Lee. I'm a gay Asian man who work as a physician, who have been involved in community organizing, community-based research, activism, some artistic creative work, and been part of the queer community, the Asian Canadian community, the HIV community, the healthcare community in many different ways. So, and I think all of those kind of link and intersect with what we can share today. So.
Okay, thank you. So, with some of these questions, we do use the term queer liberation right in the question.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that's going to be okay, but for example, the first question is, if you can tell us a bit about your work and how it addresses queer liberation.
Okay, so I guess there's different parts of my work. There's my paid work and there's my volunteer work. I guess I used to think that my volunteer work has more to do with queer liberation. But it really started with the journey of personal liberation, I would say. Because as a queer Asian man, I struggled a lot with my own sexual identity and sexual orientation. I was aware of it before I immigrated to Canada from Hong Kong, and that was when I was very young teenagers, and it was really very challenging. And I find that there is no future, no hope. I should change my sex to become a woman in order to love a man, and so those are the kind of environment and culture and context that I grew up with, and so. And I spent 5 years in Winnipeg before I came to Toronto, and I was in a relationship with a heterosexually identified male. So I guess that kind of affected some of my thinking, and I didn't have any support. There's like about 3 or 4 queer Asian men in all of Winnipeg, and there was some gay liberation movement actually. But I was mostly a student trying to adapt, fit in, get by, and it wasn't. And partly I think I moved to Canada to explore and find out more about my identity in many different ways, especially my sexual identity. So that was a very important time, and I think having situated in Winnipeg in a relatively less well-developed Asian, well-developed, less kind of organized overall gay movement in the 70s, I really felt that I didn't understand anything about gay liberation or queer liberation or any kind of liberation. I just felt very oppressed and trapped and hopeless, right? So the thing that really, I think, affected me was when I went to bookstores and began to see books that has cover that has 2 men on it, and began to find that there are literature and gay love stories. I think it was the front runner, the first one that I discovered actually, and In Touch magazine at that point. And then I began to realize that there is a bigger connection somewhere, and then it began to challenge some of my preconceived ideas about what being gay or loving other men means if I'm male, and it also connected me to, I think, and then I think I tried to place a mail order through Glad Day Bookstore actually. And then I came to visit Toronto and went to Glad Day, and I saw a notice of a benefit that the Gay Asians Toronto was putting on right after the Bath Raid in 1981 at the 519. to fundraise for the Right to Privacy Committee. So I went to that event, and that was like a life-changing experience for me. And that was the first time that's not the first time I met other gay Asians. I met other gay Asians since I was 11 on the streets of Hong Kong and other places. But that was the first time I saw gay Asian in a community that actually are not just having sex, but actually doing something to support the community or resisting against oppression in some constructive way. And that was very moving for me. And having been in a city that was not very gay supportive, and having been in an environment that was very secluded, that just sparked something in me that was both inspiring and scary and exciting and whatever, right? So, and at that time I got into med school in Toronto, so I moved to Toronto that summer and began to get involved with Gay Asians Toronto, which was just formed about 6 months before that. And then I kind of learned about gay liberation, about community organizing, and I felt a passion for it because the way it helped me change the way I perceive myself and my possibilities and my identity, right? So because I remember how bad I felt and how isolated I felt, and how getting to know other friends and getting involved in the group, it was quite small at the time. There's basically I think 8 to 12 people probably, and most of the activities were coming out, reflective, discussion group, support group kind of activities. But it was tremendously helpful for me, and so I see what it can do to help me. So I thought it's something worthwhile to support and get involved in it, do more, right? And so that's my kind of how I got connected to the queer community or the queer liberation movement. You have to ask me other questions too.
Okay, all right, that's good, that's very good.
Yes, but there was the time, I just watched We Were Here last night too, so, the documentary.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, that's the documentary about AIDS in San Francisco.
Yes, that's right.
Right,
Yes,
it's
yes,
kind
yes.
of like, really, anyway. Okay, so it's just I can take it to a different angle, and I don't know what will come out in each angle, but anyway, I don't want to go for like 2 hours though. So.
Yeah, so we'll have to watch time
Yeah.
as well on that. Okay, good. So, if you want to go to where you were just talking about, saying some of the community development work that you've done around gay Asians here in Toronto. Because you were just talking about gay Asians Toronto itself, to Toronto Med School.
So, when I first got involved with Gay Asians Toronto, it was actually very politically minded. Almost all the people, half of the people involved were quite involved with the larger gay liberation movement. But I also see a lot of Asians in bars and other social spaces who doesn't come to Gay Asians Toronto's events. And so I started to question why, and if I get so excited about it, why isn't other people joining in, right? So I think there was, I guess now we probably can call it political elitism, or just people are pretty apolitical, and they thought that politics are for really radical people and that doesn't touch their life in meaningful ways or something. But there was a division between what people perceive to be importance of social space and just fulfilling their personal needs versus changing the system or challenging the politics and the government policies. But I kind of see it differently. I saw that the social was political because I thought that overcoming isolation, creating communities were political because we didn't have those. Now we have all sorts of businesses and corporate support for all sorts of events and social spaces. So people probably doesn't see that as political. But I think back in the days of the late 70s and early 80s, the fact that there is a social space that support queer Asians talking about their issues, that can relate to issues of coming out, that can draw support from each other, I thought it was highly political. Because coming from Hong Kong and many other places, I knew that there wasn't such places there. And so I tried to really push for taking a more social, community building kind of orientation with the group and organize more social activities, creative projects that brought people together. We created a magazine, we created variety shows that get people to perform in, and we do slideshows that document our oral history and stuff like that. Well, not me, but I try to facilitate some of those teamwork to do that. And I think the result was quite remarkable. So the group grew to a membership of over 200 within a couple of years, and we actually end up being the first community group, I think, that organized a fundraiser to raise money for HIV back in '83, before ACT was even formed. And again, that took place in 519, and that was Gay Asians Showcase Event Celebration. We changed the ATION to ASIAN. And it was, at that particular event, I think we were able to draw together very diverse membership from our communities. We had a very popular drag performance group at that point called the Oriental Express, who were filling houses every weekend in Manatee Bar at that time. We had academic students who volunteered to work on an oral history slideshow that captured some of the issues affecting gay Asian men at that time, called, I don't know whether it's the Visible Invisible or the Invisible Visibles, which I thought was a very smart title. And we had other people who did other creative stuff and performances and stuff. And we put together a show at the 519, and we raised, I think, 500 or some, not a huge lot of money, but we donated it to Hassle Free, which were holding money for ACT at that point before it was formally established. And it was a great experience because I think that was the time when other community members began to buy in the fact that they can contribute politically, and they don't all have to be marching on the streets and screaming slogans or writing literature, and stuff like that, and they can all contribute to the community. And I think that was a very important experience for the queer Asian communities. I guess somewhere before then, another kind of important historic experience was the fact, I think in 1981, when Pride Day, I think there was the second year of Pride in Toronto, and they wanted to host it at Grange Park. And I think there was a huge resistance and protest from the Chinatown community, which is located right next to Grange Park, right? That opposed the festivities from happening. And so, so the organizers came to Gay Asians Toronto and asked for our support. They wanted to prove these Chinatown people wrong. There are queers in the Asian community, right? And actually, I think Richard was away at that time. Richard was one of the key organizers. Richard Fong was one of the key organizers, and there wasn't a lot of people ready to. Well, actually, they wanted an Asian person to speak on Pride Day because just to prove them wrong, or to show us that there are, queer Asians are part of the queer community or gay community, or gay and lesbian community. And so I just got involved not too long ago, but I guess at that particular time nobody in the group was ready and willing to make a response to commit to speaking on the pride. And so I agreed to do that because I thought it was really important. And it's also, I guess, not every day that the gay Asian community get asked to do such pivotal things that might impact the rest of the larger queer community. So I thought it was an important opportunity not to just say no to. So that was, again, a very personally liberating and also challenging time for me, because it was my first year in med school. I wasn't out, and to anybody outside the gay community, I wasn't out to my family, and I don't know what kind of media or coverage or anything would be. So that was a big personal journey, and actually Gary Kinsman and Tim McCaskill and Richard Fung and a lot of people actually helped me prepare that speech that I gave on Pride Day at Grange Park, and we worked very hard to get other gay Asian members to show up, because we were supposed to also lead the parade that year through Chinatown. And so that was a very hard thing to do in 1981. And so, or was it 1982? I can't remember. So anyway, it might have been 1982. Anyway, so at that time it was the second Pride Day for sure, and it was happening at Grange Park, and we had to lead the parade through Chinatown. So we worked really hard to say that this is very important for our community, and we need to show that we have people there, and we need to claim that as part of our community. And I think we ended up having like over 20 gay Asian walking with us on the parade through Chinatown, and that was historic. And for actually many years after that, I'm not sure we have that turned out. So it actually brought tears to my eyes when I saw, again, the queer Asian community leading the Pride Parade this year, and have probably, close to 200 people in that segment of the parade. So I think we have grown, things have changed. But I thought that, looking back at those times, I think queer liberation, I think, is meaningful if it does lead to personal liberation for the people that it involved. So that was kind of my early journeys with Gay Asians Toronto, and I think after we pursued a more inclusive social community building kind of approach, we were able to also keep that political vision, and we worked very closely with both what we call the mainstream gay community, and at that time, like the body politic was a big part of that, and with other queer people of color group that were starting around the same time. So there was SAMI for the black queer community. There was KUSH for the South Asian community. And another kind of pivotal event was, I think, in '84 or something. There was a big protest from the black gay community against an ad in the body politic that basically asked for black houseboy for white masters. So the debate at that time, and actually like Gay Asians and SAMI and KUSH, another member actually band together, and we demanded a meeting with the body politic collective, and I was there, and I remember the debate was, is gay liberation or the freedom to be just sexually liberated more important than racism and other forms of oppression, right? So basically, I think the message we got from the Body Politic Collective was that sexual freedom and liberation should be the supreme freedom and right in the gay liberation movement. All these other things should be subsidiary to that, right? So you can't be always politically correct because this is part of the sexual fantasy, so you shouldn't censor the sexual fantasy because it's because it can be construed or perceived to be racist and so on and so forth. So I think that was a very hurtful experience. That was the first time, well, not the first time, but that was a very explicit reminder that we think we belong, but we don't really belong. That goes beyond even the fact that no Asian man's ever been on the cover of Body Politic or any gay queer magazine for that matter, up to that point I think, or like how we define what is beauty in the gay media and all that stuff, right? And that still get talked about today. But I think that is very different when you get told by who you consider to be your allies and your friends, your issue and how you feel is not as important because they have the greater intellectual interpretation of what the world or what gay liberation is supposed to be. Right? And so that was a big struggle, and we went through a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. We held workshops again at the 519. We have a panel of speakers that has different queer men and women of color, other activists active in the anti-racism movement. And I don't think it ever was really resolved. I thought it was just like an angry debate that kept going on for a while, and then, nothing really changed, except, there are more awareness on the issues that get tabled.
And that forum, was it based on that incident that
Mhm.
happened? Because that ad appeared in
Yeah.
Big Politics, and so
Yeah.
that spurred this forum so that
Yeah.
we can talk about it
Yeah.
again already.
Yeah. So I think that was in '84. So, and then in '85, we were part of the organizing of the International Gay and Lesbian Association conference in Toronto, and Celebration was actually the closing cultural event for that conference. So again, I think that was quite significant, and that was, I guess, another positive strategy to claim our place in the bigger queer community. And it's not just an Asian show. We have people like Faith Nolan, David Sarita, and all sorts of diversity, people from the Asian lesbians of the East Coast, from New York, and other groups all perform in it. But it is under the Queer Asian banner, and we were hosting that event. So I think that's another example. We can fight our battles in many different ways. So that was a positive strategy, and I think it worked beautifully. And I think after that, that conference actually helped us build connection to Asia, who were actually actively building the queer liberation movement at that point in time as well. So there are activists from Japan and Hong Kong who were at the conference, and we built connection, and actually that kind of affected part of my personal journey later on when I went back to Hong Kong and started one of the earliest gay community groups in Hong Kong. So things are all kind of have a karma of its own, I guess. But I think the main challenge is with facing the queer Asian community in the organizing. From my experiences, where the dichotomy between how our own community members perceive political versus social, and how people are threatened and intimidated or alienated by the notion of being political, right? And how actually that could be overcome and integrated in a very inclusive, helpful way. And I guess the other big issue is the battle between reconciling different forms of oppression within the queer liberation movement, and a lot of people in the gay Asian community talk about the double alienation we feel from our own racial communities, the homophobia we encounter, cultural upbringing and all that stuff, and the racism we felt in the gay community, right? So I think in my personal experience, I had encountered both, and I have survived both and got something out of both. So I think it's not even just that. It's also how it affected how we related to other marginalized communities, right? And how we learned to deal with other forms of oppression as well. So I think that was a very informative stage in my life that I learned a great deal of. And that was all before I was a doctor.
Wow, that's quite a development,
Yeah.
personally and community-wise.
Yeah. So, you have somebody booked at one, right?
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
But we, like you said, we don't want to
Yeah.
hold you beyond your time to
Okay,
do
so-
things. So,
So what you want?
given what you just said, before I leap too much forward, I just want to, well, maybe I will come back to it, that piece. But this was all before becoming a physician, but I know you've been very active as a physician in this community as well. And you did start off saying something along the lines of you had felt at one point doing gay liberation or queer liberation work was more in the voluntary sector or as a volunteer, but you have come to realize that even in your paid work, it comes up as well. So do you want to talk a bit about what it was like either being a med student to becoming a doctor and how you've applied those skills in community development?
I don't know, actually, is it possible to get some of those footage from my own personal archives at some point?
It may be,
Because
because part of the green screen, again, is what we want to flash behind people. We want to match to what they're talking about, right? So it
So
might
do
be.
you mean for us to give you some, or for you
Yeah.
to give us some?
no, for you to give me some.
Yeah, no, we can do that, absolutely.
That's going to be part of our post-production work, is to go to the archives and see what we can uncover based on what people
Because
are
like when I
telling
did
us.
the Nancy Nichols thing and standing together,
Yeah.
anyway, so then she wanted to use that for the archives, right? And then I never really asked for a copy, but it's just like when because I know that like probably like 15 seconds of these is gonna end up in the product, right? So, I think there's a way that I narrate my own communities or personal experience that is kind of probably important for me that I would appreciate having a record of,
Yeah.
right? Because if you have transcripts, then I would ask for a transcript, but
Right.
but anyway, we can talk
Yeah,
more
no,
about that.
that's-
But I would appreciate that because I think I'm trying to organize some of those thoughts into making it available as some sort of resources at Oral History as well. Anyway, so
And the other thing I wanted to ask you too was that you were involved in helping produce artistic and production work. So we can get some of that as pictures, or if it's going to happen again, so I can
Yeah.
take some shots and films of it.
we have some archival videos of some of those shows and stuff, and we certainly have our newsletter. I think the archives has copies of our newsletters at that point. But anyway, yeah, we can talk about that. So I guess we could jump to after I graduated. Somewhere in between there was the connection to the Hong Kong 10% Club that I helped form, but I don't think I don't know if you want that international perspective, but I guess from a more personal stream, if I follow that stream. So I think I graduated in 1986, and I spent a year in Hong Kong, and I got involved with the gay community there and helped form the first gay community group that are incorporated legally. I mean, there are other actually activist groups and publications before then, most notably Sam Sasha, who is a well-published author who wrote a history of homosexuality in China and translated some of the coming out literature in Chinese and so on. And he started a newsletter and a group. But the 10% group was important historically in a way that it was the first legally incorporated community organization. And it had a lot of public events both political and social, again, combining this, what I learned from the Gay Asians Toronto experience, and we were able to put together hundreds and hundreds of people in our events. And we actually also put on a gay play in the Hong Kong Art Festival at that time. And then it was also at the same time when Hong Kong was actively working on the decriminalization of homosexuality legislative changes. So the community group actually became a very pivotal force in lobbying for that legislative changes that eventually did come through. I have left Hong Kong by the time that happened, but the group and the many members involved with that group was the pivotal force that advocate for that change. So that was a very important page of my personal journey as well. But coming back and trying to develop as a physician, that was the time when there was very little, well, there was still the relatively early days of HIV/AIDS. There's not a lot of, well, no, actually, so, let me think. So when I started off, when I graduated from med school, that was the early days of HIV/AIDS, and we have some community services, but I remember at that time, there was the AIDS Committee of Toronto, and actually I was involved with some of that work when they were located on top of Kentucky Fried Chicken on Church Street, on Wellesley Street. But after I graduated, I think they relocated to 464 College, Yonge Street. And Doug Stewart was working as a counselor at ACT at that time. And I was called in to provide buddy support for an Asian person living with HIV who didn't speak any English. And we didn't have any support system set up for queer Asian or Asian affected by HIV at that point. There was actually, I think, I wasn't even sure if PWA was even started. But anyway, so that was before I graduated. I was actually, I think I was still in school. And I learned to support the person, and at the same time learn about all the treatments that he's supposed to have, that it wasn't available, and he was too afraid to advocate it or even bring it up to his doctors to negotiate it, and he couldn't access any support from the other systems because he was so afraid, and he can't tell anybody he has HIV, and he can access very limited support from the non-Chinese speaking system. So it was really quite tragic and horrible and all that. But I think the thing that really made the community went forward was the fact that we began to really actually literally see some of our community members got really ill, and then they disappeared from the community. They don't go out to bars anymore. They don't access any support from friends. People struggle between gossiping and supporting the person, because basically I don't think people were just gossiping about the person. People were articulating their own fear. People were trying to figure out what they can do, but they don't know how to do it, right? So it was a very desperate times, and I think that I don't think that. So anyway, so that was a really desperate time, and so Gay Asians took up a natural role in its evolution, trying to plan responses to those kind of crises, and it became, I guess it was just an automatic need and mission that we need to do, right? Because it's our friends who are dying, and we need to do something about it. But Chinatown beat us to government resources, and I think it's important politically to recognize that the Gay Asians Toronto, up to that point, and probably most people in the queer community, has never accessed public resources beyond the 519 community health and community center spaces and resources, right? So we've never asked for program funding. We don't know the first thing about City Hall and how it works and all that stuff. So when we wanted to do HIV work, besides getting people from ACT to do educational workshop with us and stuff like that, and connecting with other Asian groups in San Francisco and New York who are also facing the same issues, we were basically, and then because I just graduated from med school, I was asked by actually Olivia Chow, who was a school trustee at that time, to sit on HIV prevention project at one of the Chinatown agencies, because they've gotten public money to do HIV work. And that began the most interesting and frustrating community learning that I had in my early career. So I sat on that committee with Olivia and with Ed Jackson, who was working at AIDS Committee of Toronto then, and some other people. And for 6 months, we could not get them to put anything about gay or men who have sex with men. Well, that term wasn't even coined at that time, right? In any of the materials or content that they do. All they wanted to do was some generic AIDS 101, how to put on a condom thing for ESL classes. And so after working with them and one weekend actually, like I remember going to Olivia Chow and Jack Layton's place and sit down and actually work through the whole, well at that time we were still doing slideshows, right? Slide by slide scripts on how to make those content more personal that reflect some of the needs of the affected communities. And basically the community center decided to throw all that out the window. They don't want to do anything like that. So that was the time that I realized we have to do something for our own community. We can't count on, the mainstream Chinatown to do that, right? And so that's kind of, so we started a process really going back again to Gay Asians Toronto to look at how we can create a community response. So from the funders' perspective, there's always like, you shouldn't duplicate programs, how do you, why can't you work with whatever exists and all that stuff, right? And because we were not experienced service providers, if we've never asked for public money, all our programs are community, spontaneous responses and stuff like that. So anyway, so we form a group, we pull in people who are more experienced with health and education and stuff, and we created the Gay Asian AIDS Project. And I think of most of the groups in Toronto, we were the only HIV project that had gay in its name. And it was politically important and necessary because we had to distinguish ourselves from all these other ethno-racial projects that has gotten HIV prevention education money from the city. And so actually it was a very galvanizing time for the community because, and it was important that we actually went through that social community development stage because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to mount that response, right? And it actually brought together people from all walks of life in our communities, and everybody was, volunteering, like hairdressers was helping to cut people's hair, travel agents are trying to get people support to, going back to their home country to be reconnected to their family before they die, and bankers were helping people to prepare power of attorney when they can no longer handle their finances, and it's like, we have people from all walks of life in our community, and they all came together in that response. It was quite remarkable. And so as a physician, I learned to be not just a medical practitioner at that point because I saw that as a very holistic response. And it's not just about medicine. And because of my background working in the community, before I was trained as a physician, I thought, I learned to try to integrate some of those aspects together. And so we actually did educational workshops that are knowledge-based, but also deal a lot with, the social reality that affects the ability that people can negotiate safer sex, affect the ability that people can access services, right? And so it actually gave a new life and meaning to the group, and we grew with, I think, a lot of other groups in the gay and lesbian and queer community to mature through that very painful multiple laws and traumatic processes of the early days of AIDS, right? And I think we all became a much stronger community. And the other challenge, though, I felt as a gay activist and as a service provider is that it's harder for people to access me as a physician at first, because I'm the same person who organized parties for them. I'm the same person who perform on the same stage with them, you know, and hang out in the same bars, right? And there's not a whole lot of role models at that time. You know, we were always counting on people who are established in other roles to help ourselves. So for us, it was a learning experience, how we can grow into service providers. So I think my personal learning in that professional way also informed the way that a lot of our volunteers and community people grow into service provider role in the HIV movement, right? And so I think that was interesting. I guess the other thing that was kind of important and probably relevant that I wanted to talk about, and I did talk about that in the mid-90s, was the trauma and the devastation of HIV and the draining of resources and refocusing that actually took away from a lot of the work, focused on other issues related to gay and lesbian or queer liberation. And so for many years, Gay Asians Toronto became the Gay Asian AIDS Project, and there isn't anything else about being gay or Asian being done besides all centered around the responses to HIV. Mind you, it's a very holistic response to HIV, but still, it's all about HIV, right? And it's all about dealing with flaws, dealing with advocating for services, building resources, and all that stuff. So I think by the mid-90s, people really felt that there wasn't very much of a gay liberation or even gay community development agenda. It was all about HIV/AIDS, and people get really exhausted, really fatigued, and missed some of that community thing. And even the people living with HIV missed some of that because it's not, their lives is not all about HIV, right? And so I think that was a time when we tried to really revitalize and try to bring in again the more social, creative, non-HIV elements back to the group. And I think it worked well for a number of years. And then I think in the early 2000s, we came to, I guess, the early days of internet or whatever. But there actually became a lot, also, I think what also happened was that there are other social spaces being created for queer Asians. So there are other, so there's like Asian Express, there is Scented Voice, there is the Vietnamese Gay Alliance, and different gay community groups were happening. And then Gay Asian seems to be still very focused on HIV, and then there is an interest and a mindset to look at the other political issues. And so we actually had a whole revitalization process of Gay Asians Toronto, and I was involved with that process. I didn't drive that process, but we actually did consultation with all these people who are involved with all these other groups, and asked them whether they think we should still have a Gay Asians Toronto, and if so, what did they want us to do? So people actually all wanted Gay Asians Toronto to continue and be an advocate on more political, serious issues, because we have plenty of social stuff now, you know, but we don't have a political voice. So Gay Asians was actually, again, given the mandate to do more serious educational, political work. And that kept us going for a few years. But I think that, and that I think came to, well, there's two other things. So in the mid-90s, there was issues about the coalition against homophobia that we were involved in. That was very important. I think it was 95 or 96. There was, Gay Asian actually won the Pride Prize with our float. We have a balloon dragon and we dressed up in all these costumes and we make slogans that is a take on a twist of the Toys R Us thing, and it was really fun and creative. Anyway, so we won the award that year in the Pride Flow, but then we saw a very homophobic tabloid coverage in the Chinese media that says, "Do people afflicted with homosexuality deserve to have pride?" That was the headline of the front page story, right? And it was brought to us by a parent of a gay Asian youth. And they said, "You guys should do something about it." So we, well, I mean, we didn't have any choice. A parent is asking us to do something about homophobia, right? So we actually, you know, and thankfully, because of all the HIV work that we've done, we actually also grew out of the shell of being a very sheltered and gay community specific group. We actually began to, through the HIV and health work, we actually began to broaden our network much beyond the queer communities. We actually, by necessity, learned to work with other cultural communities, other mainstream health and social services, government systems in a much more elaborate way, right? So we were able to work very closely with a lot of social justice allies through that movement and put together a community response, and it actually also get a lot of support from many other cultural. The Jewish community was facing the same issues of homophobia in their own media. Polish communities was fighting the same battle. The black communities fighting the same battle. So we quickly formed a coalition against homophobia, and we actually also have allies now in the Chinese Canadian community that we can draw on to sign our petition, to flood them with faxes of protest, and to threaten them with legal lawsuit because we have, you know, Asian Canadian gay lawyers who will do pro bono work to prepare those legal letters, right? So within, I think, 3 weeks, we were able to get a total full front page apology and an alternate issue covering our voices in the same Chinese paper. And that was a tremendous victory for the queer Asian community, and it spawned off a whole anti-homophobia campaign in ethno-racial communities for the next 3 years. So that was between, I think, 95 or 6 to 98. And so that was another, I think, good moment in our history. I think the last bit of, well, not the last bit, but another later, probably the more recent political involvement that the queer Asian community and I myself have some role to play before the Pride fiasco was the campaign for equal family. Right? So I think it's 2003, or somewhere around that time when Ontario, was it Canada or Ontario?
It was Ontario, and that would have been 94, actually.
The equal marriage, I mean.
Oh, you're talking about equal marriage,
Yeah.
and then
No,
we're
equal
talking
family.
the 2000s.
Yeah.
And that would be Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the campaign for equal marriage
Yes.
in the early 2000s. And we again were called to respond because I was involved also with the Chinese Canadian National Council, which is an anti-racist social justice national organization. And we got call from the CBC to send a speaker to their debate forum to speak against the campaign for equal marriage, because a lot of the opposition voices from for that campaign actually came from ethno-racial communities and a lot from the Chinese Canadian community and the religious Chinese Canadian community in BC. So they actually call up this anti-racist organization who supported human rights all the time to speak against it. And then the staff actually sent it out to the board members to ask for a response. So that actually, triggered a lot of anger and frustration, of course, in the progressive Chinese Canadian community, and it also triggered the fact that we need to do something more proactive about that. So working with Gay Asians Toronto, working with other allies, we formed the Asian, what do we call ourselves? I think Asian Canadians for Equal Marriage, I think. And which basically, we did a lot of media work and public education forums on the issues of same-sex marriage and why it's important, and basically to counter the mainstream perception and opposition voices that comes from a lot of the Asian Canadian communities. And so we have people like Christian Wong Tam, who are very active in that campaign, working with us and as part of that community. And we work very closely with the main campaign too, but again, like I must say, in that whole organizing experience, it was at the same time alienating, because it felt that we were assigned a almost tokenistic role in the mainstream movement. You address your community's problems, that kind of mentality, rather than, we honor your contribution and this is really important and you are as part of the main campaign as we are, right? And so I think that really was how I felt during that. But we were happy to just make whatever contribution we can make to that issue, because we felt it was important. But it wasn't the most positive experience internally, I think, connecting to the bigger movement. Actually, I think it did reinforce a fairly substantive sense of alienation. At least that's how I felt. Anyway, but again, that issue was a success and we were happy to be part of it. I don't think we get any credit for it, but it doesn't really matter. So I think that was probably one of the more recent larger scale community organizing on a political level that I remember in the queer Asian communities. And that was quite a few years ago. Yeah.
Early to mid 2000s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what I need to say about the pride thing. I don't know if there's much to be said, really.
What do you want to say about the pride thing? I mean, for us with that, and some people have touched on it, there are the themes. Many groups and individuals responded to what was happening there. And I think for us, some of the big themes that do connect to queer liberation is that we've felt there was an affront, if not an actual assault, on freedom of speech and the freedom of expression.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we come to a place in a community where we are to say who can be in the parade and who can't be in the parade, it's concerning. And I don't know if in any way you link to that, because you took a very public action that got a lot of attention, and it was very principled. And
so I guess I think Pride 2010, was that Pride 2010?
yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think Pride 2010 was a very interesting experience for me, because it was the 20th anniversary of, 20th anniversary of Pride, or something, right? No, 30.
Or exclusion, or not really being heard.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that changed a whole
Mhm.
lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm opening up a space here for some critique of why this is happening in our movement. And I suspect that it's not, no, it's not just Asians. It's black people
Yeah.
and it's disabled
Yeah, yeah,
people and it's
yeah.
trans and it's,
Yeah.
you know, not just why, also what we need to do to be better at this, that we are a more cohesive movement.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your interpretation of that? How do you see it?
Well, I think well, if you ask me about my sense of alienation and marginalization within the queer community and movement, I think it's just a microcosm of the larger racist, heterosexist society, right? I think, we internalize some of those power and oppressive values into how we interact with each other. So unless we took an active role in critiquing, developing skills to be more aware and making a proactive commitment to change that, it's just almost a natural tendency for that to happen, right? And so it's always like, one thing that I've been pushing in the service sector is people keep talking about literacy. People keep talking about, making it more accessible in terms of the languages and making sure that people, no, actually, let me rephrase that. So one of the things that I've been trying to tell other allies and policymakers in the health service sector is that, I think one of the things we often ask people is how they can communicate more effectively with other people, right? But I think one of the impetus or one of the main thing that people who are in positions of power or even who control access to services or who are providing services needs to do is to really listen differently. You shouldn't expect your community or your clients or your service users or your constituencies to speak your language so that you can understand. You need to change the way you listen so that you can understand, right? So I think that's the whole power dynamics that is challenging because it's counterintuitive in a way that people are comfortable with, holding on to their power. People are comfortable with the way the society is constructed, especially if they are in a relatively more comfortable position. Consulting, collaborating, listening to diverse voices is exhausting. It's work. And if I can make a decision and if I, can lead a campaign without listening to all these different dissenting, diverse voices, why would I bother, right? But I think you need to really buy into a vision that it actually can enrich your work, right? Because before you would care to listen. And I think it has to be value-based. And I think we can do a lot of more work to really honor that lived experiences and diversity in our communities. And I think it can inform much richer work, much more innovation, because, as like the queer community is creative and innovative because we have to deal with all forms of oppression, right? So what didn't kill us make us stronger, right? What we survived through make us richer. So, if people just can expand their mind to think that way, I think we would be a much more healthier and vibrant community.
That's great. Was there anything more that you wanted to add, given the kind of conversation we've had? Anything that you may have missed or you think is important to share?
I can't think of anything now. No, I was thinking of something I already forgot as I was talking, so that's not good. So, no, there's always something more to say, but I think I said quite enough. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. There was this last point I was trying to think of. What was it? Oh, no.
Oh, take it back, I know I kind of brought in that
Mm.
whole issue, that where you ended off talking before I came in
Mhm.
was on Pride 2010, you were upset around people wanting party over politics and celebrating,
Mhm.
and how you were saddened by, I guess, the lack of value that's attached or associated with doing political community development work, as opposed to just going out and having one big social party scene.
Oh, I guess, no, the other thing that I wanted to say was related to, I think part of the challenge of why sometimes we are hesitant or why we are not as inclusive and honoring of other people's experiences as we should have been might be the fact that we felt that we were not being listened to. We hasn't had our needs being taken care of. So every chance we got, we end up wanting to showcase what we believe in, have our stories heard first, rather than our community's stories collectively being heard. So I think some parts that facilitate true community building is really honoring each and every one of our own stories and our own needs first. And I think when people have a chance to really look after their own needs, they can be more effective in being inclusive and honoring other people as well. So I think it goes back to, it's kind of like a surface thing, right? You need to take care of basic survival needs before you can be volunteering on boards and stuff, right? Because, why would I worry about that if I can feed myself and have safe shelter? So I think part of the struggle with some of the groups I've been with, whether it is the queer Asian community, whether it's the larger queer community, whether it is the immigrant community or HIV community, one of a very common struggle is the fact that our stories hasn't been heard impact on our ability to listen. So I think creating that space where we can truly listen and learn from each other, I think it would be a very healthy place to start. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was the point I was forgetting.
Yeah, so we got it in there, that's
Yeah.
great.
Not totally seen.
Oh, it
Okay.
means to me a lot as well.
Okay.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
you're
Ellen.
welcome.
That was
Thank you.
good, even though we didn't do that kind of formal
Yeah,
questions, I
that's
thought
okay. I
that was
think
great
some
sharing.
came across.
Yeah.
Okay,
some
great.
good
Thanks for
points.
including me.
Yes.
So I hope that